Welcome to Hidden Cults, the podcast that shines a light into the shadows. Here we explore the strange, the secretive, and the spiritually seductive. From fringe religions to doomsday prophets, from communes to corporate empires, these are the movements that promised meaning, and sometimes delivered something far more dangerous. I'm your host, and in each episode, we uncover the true stories behind the world's most controversial cults, the leaders who led them, the followers who followed, and the echoes they left behind. If you or someone you care about has been impacted by a cult, you're not alone. There is help. Whether you're still inside a cult or trying to process what you've been through, support is out there. You can find organizations and hotlines in the description of this episode. You deserve freedom, healing, and a life that's truly your own. Reach out. The first step is often the hardest, but it's also the most powerful. If you'd like to share your story and experiences with a cult, you can email it to me, and I will read it on a future Listener Stories episode. Your anonymity is guaranteed. Always. Today's episode. Let's begin. Desteni, Part 1, Bernard Poolman, Namibia, Policing, Occult Claims, and Reinvention. Long before Desteni became known online for bizarre channeling videos, reptilian cosmology, and endless self-forgiveness statements, the movement revolved around one man, Bernard Poolman. To followers, he was a visionary exposing hidden systems controlling humanity. To critics and former members, he was a manipulative and psychologically overpowering figure who built a high-control belief system around himself while disguising it as liberation. Poolman's story began in southern Africa during the apartheid era, inside a society already shaped by control, hierarchy, fear, and ideological conflict. He was born in Okahanja, Namibia, during the period when the territory remained under South African administration. Public details about his early childhood are surprisingly limited, which later helped create an almost mythic quality around him inside Desteni circles. Much of what is known about his early life comes either from his own later accounts, former associates, or scattered reporting rather than conventional biography. What consistently appears across accounts is that Poolman developed an early fascination with authority, religion, psychology, and hidden systems of power. Former followers later described him as unusually intense, intellectually aggressive, and capable of dominating conversations through confidence alone. Even critics who came to despise him often admitted he possessed a strange kind of charisma that made people feel actually outmatched very quickly. He eventually studied law in South Africa and graduated in the early 1980s. After university, he entered the South African police force and worked as a detective during one of the most politically tense periods in the country's history. That background mattered because policing exposed him directly to violence, fear, interrogation methods, criminal psychology, and authoritarian systems long before Desteni existed. Poolman later described his police years almost like the beginning of a supernatural awakening. According to his own stories, he became deeply involved with spirit communication through his father-in-law, who allegedly worked as a trance medium capable of contacting entities from other dimensions. Poolman claimed these sessions went far beyond ordinary spiritualism. He described direct interaction with non-human intelligences, warnings from spirits, and experiences that convinced him humanity was trapped inside hidden systems of manipulation most people could not perceive. One story he repeated frequently involved a supposed supernatural warning received while investigating a case as a detective. According to Poolman, spirits told him he would be killed if he continued his police work. He later described this moment as one of the major reasons he left law enforcement and moved to Durban. Whether these events happened literally is impossible to verify. What matters is that Poolman treated them as foundational truths and used them later to build authority inside Desteni. The stories established him not simply as someone interested in spirituality, but as someone claiming privileged access to hidden realities. During the years after leaving the police force, Poolman moved through a series of reinventions that gradually blended together into the ideology that would eventually become Desteni. Former associates and critics later described him experimenting with occult symbolism, conspiracy theories, New Age ideas, anti-religious rhetoric, and alternative psychology. Some accused him of fascination with satanic imagery or authoritarian figures, while others described him as deliberately provocative rather than genuinely devoted to any single tradition. Poolman himself often played with dark imagery in public talks. He referred to himself as the Beast, the most evil man on earth, and sometimes used theatrical, almost mocking presentations involving exaggerated laughter or confrontational language. He mixed this with claims about exposing deception, destroying ego, and revealing the real nature of existence, hiding underneath mainstream religion and spirituality. This contradiction became one of the defining features of his personality. He mocked conventional spirituality while speaking constantly about demons, dimensions, entities, and hidden cosmic systems. He criticized gurus while positioning himself as someone uniquely capable of exposing reality. He attacked organized religion while simultaneously presenting his own worldview as humanity's only practical path to freedom. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Poolman shifted heavily into educational software and mind development programs. He became involved in selling products aimed at improving learning ability, reading speed, attention, and intelligence in children. The business eventually evolved into what later became connected to TechnoTutor and related systems. Former associates later accused Poolman of using highly manipulative sales techniques, particularly when targeting parents desperate to help children struggling with school or behavioral issues. One former assistant claimed ordinary software products were sold at massively inflated prices through emotional pressure and exaggerated promises. Critics later argued that these business practices foreshadowed the way Desteni itself would eventually monetize self-improvement and psychological transformation. Around the same period, Poolman developed many of the techniques and ideas that later became central to Desteni doctrine. He became obsessed with language, thought patterns, and what he described as mind programming. He argued that human beings were not truly conscious individuals, but systems running pre-installed patterns created by external forces. Thoughts, emotions, personalities, desires, and fears were described not as authentic selfhood, but as programming. This idea later became one of the absolute foundations of Desteni. Poolman's early writings promoted the belief that the mind itself was the problem. Humanity, according to him, existed inside systems of conditioning so deep that most people could not even recognize them. Traditional spirituality, religion, politics, and even ordinary emotion became evidence of manipulation rather than truth. One event from this period became especially important in Desteni mythology. Poolman claimed that during a filmed software interview, a cameraman suddenly became possessed by a demon and began convulsing violently. According to Poolman, he guided the man through a process of saying, "I forgive myself," which supposedly expelled or transformed the possessing force. He later claimed the frightened crew destroyed the footage afterward. This story became the birth of what Desteni later called self-forgiveness. Rather than asking forgiveness from God or another person, Poolman taught that individuals needed to repeatedly forgive themselves for every thought, emotion, fear, reaction, desire, or belief they had accepted and allowed within themselves. Endless spoken and written statements became the movement's central psychological practice. Another story involved Poolman claiming that his home had been vandalized with satanic graffiti threatening him and his son. He interpreted this not as ordinary criminal behavior, but as evidence of demonic interference connected to his spiritual work. According to later Desteni teachings, Poolman and his children absorbed hundreds of demons into themselves and transformed them through forgiveness practices. To outsiders, these stories sounded absurd or theatrical. To followers, they became proof that Poolman possessed knowledge about hidden dimensions, consciousness, and humanity's true condition. By the early 2000s, many of the ingredients of Desteni already existed, even before the movement officially appeared online. Poolman had combined conspiracy thinking, anti-ego philosophy, occult language, psychological manipulation, self-help methods, internet communication, and supernatural authority into one evolving worldview. What he still lacked was the event that would transform a private ideology into a public movement. That event arrived when he claimed to have opened what Desteni would later call the portal. Part 2. The Farm, the Portal, and the Birth of Desteni. By the early 2000s, Bernard Poolman had already built the core ideas that would later define Desteni. He believed humanity was trapped inside mental programming installed by hidden interdimensional forces. He claimed ordinary spirituality was deception. He promoted self-forgiveness as a method of dismantling the mind, and increasingly presented himself as someone capable of seeing beyond normal reality. But at that stage, most of it still existed within a relatively small circle of people around him. That changed on a farm near Pietermaritzburg in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The farm became the physical and ideological center of Desteni, a place where followers lived, worked, filmed content, practiced self-forgiveness routines, and slowly disconnected from ordinary life outside the group. Money generated through Poolman's earlier educational software businesses reportedly helped establish the property and sustain the growing inner circle gathering around him. Life there revolved increasingly around Poolman's authority. Former members later described long conversations, endless philosophical debates, emotional confrontations, and constant attempts to deconstruct the ego or programmed mind. Followers were encouraged to see ordinary emotions, relationships, opinions, and even personality itself as artificial systems controlling them. The atmosphere was intense from the beginning. People who entered the farm environment often arrived searching for meaning, emotional stability, spiritual understanding, or personal transformation. Poolman positioned himself as someone capable of stripping away illusion and exposing the hidden machinery underneath human consciousness. At the center of this growing movement stood a young woman named Sunette Spies. According to Desteni's internal history, Poolman met Sunette after the death of her mother from cancer. She was brought into the farm environment while emotionally vulnerable and grieving. Poolman later claimed he recognized unique abilities within her and eventually guided her through an event that transformed the entire movement. This became known inside Desteni as opening the portal. Poolman claimed that around 2006 or 2007, he physically placed his hands on Sunette's back and instructed her to let go. According to the story repeated inside the group, this action opened an interdimensional gateway allowing beings, entities, historical figures, demons, and even objects to communicate directly through her body and voice. From that point forward, Sunette Spies was presented not simply as a psychic or medium, but as the interdimensional portal. This claim became the foundation of Desteni's public identity. Through Sunette, followers claimed they could communicate with Adolf Hitler, Jesus, Marilyn Monroe, Bruce Lee, demons, reptiles, dead historical figures, extraterrestrial entities, animals, and even inanimate objects such as sand or toilet paper. Poolman presented this not as entertainment or symbolic metaphor, but as literal proof that Desteni possessed direct access to hidden dimensions of existence. The movement quickly became infamous online because of these videos. In the late 2000s, YouTube was still relatively unfiltered compared to later years, and bizarre fringe content could spread rapidly through shock value alone. Desteni videos began circulating widely because viewers could hardly believe what they were watching. One of the most controversial examples involved Hitler. Inside Desteni material, Hitler was often referred to as my key, and channeling sessions portrayed him as a misunderstood or redeemed figure undergoing self-forgiveness in the afterlife. Other videos involved reptilian creator beings such as Anu, whom Desteni described as one of the architects of humanity's mental enslavement. The effect online was immediate. Some viewers treated the videos as comedy or internet absurdity. Others became genuinely curious. A smaller group became deeply invested in the cosmology Poolman and Desteni were building around the channelings. That cosmology grew increasingly elaborate. Humanity, according to Desteni, had been designed and programmed by interdimensional reptilian beings who harvested emotional energy from people trapped inside cycles of fear, desire, conflict, religion, and ego. Thoughts themselves were considered suspect. Individual personality was treated almost like a virus or illusion, preventing genuine equality and awareness. Poolman argued that nearly everything humans believed about themselves was false. Religion was deception. Love was often deception. Spirituality was deception. Morality was programming. Free will itself was questionable. The only way out, according to Desteni, was through radical self-deconstruction using self-forgiveness, writing exercises, and total confrontation with one's own mind patterns. What made the movement especially strange was the contradiction running through it. Desteni constantly attacked traditional spirituality and New Age nonsense, while simultaneously relying on channeling sessions involving demons, dimensions, aliens, and dead historical figures. Poolman claimed mainstream spiritual systems were traps, while presenting Desteni's supernatural framework as uniquely practical and real. This contradiction confused outsiders but strengthened internal belief. Followers came to see Desteni as something radically different from ordinary cult spirituality because Poolman framed the movement as anti-delusion, while simultaneously expanding its cosmology into increasingly bizarre territory. The internet became crucial to the group's survival and expansion. Unlike older cults built around geographic isolation alone, Desteni functioned heavily through online immersion. Followers blogged constantly, uploaded videos, participated in forums, and documented their journey to life publicly through endless written self-analysis. This created a permanent feedback loop. Members reinforced the ideology for one another continuously through content creation, self-confession, and public vulnerability. The movement spread internationally, not because thousands joined physically, but because people could enter the worldview remotely through YouTube, forums, blogs, and online coaching. Poolman understood this extremely well. He pushed followers to create enormous amounts of material online, partly for recruitment and partly because constant self-analysis kept members psychologically immersed inside the Desteni framework. The more someone wrote, confessed, analyzed themselves, and spoke in Desteni terminology, the harder it became to think outside the system. The farm itself also became increasingly isolated psychologically. Former members later described exhausting schedules, group criticism sessions, emotional breakdowns reframed as process, and pressure to surrender ordinary identity in favor of becoming best for all. Relationships became monitored through agreements, and members were encouraged to expose private thoughts publicly as proof of honesty and commitment. Poolman remained the central authority through all of it. Even when he avoided appearing on camera directly, his presence dominated the movement. Followers described him as intellectually overpowering, emotionally intimidating, and capable of making people doubt their own thoughts almost immediately during conversations. As Desteni expanded online, criticism expanded with it. Viewers mocked the channeling videos, critics labeled the movement cult-like, but by then, Desteni had already transformed from a private spiritual experiment on a South African farm into one of the internet's most bizarre and recognizable high-control movements. Part 3. Life Inside Desteni, Farm, Buddies, Courses, and Control. For people who only encountered Desteni through strange YouTube videos about Hitler, reptilians, or interdimensional beings, it was easy to dismiss the movement as internet absurdity. But former members consistently described something far more serious underneath the bizarre surface. Behind the channelings and conspiracy cosmology was a demanding daily system built around psychological exposure, emotional dependency, and constant ideological immersion. The center of that world was the Desteni farm near Pietermaritzburg in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The farm operated as both a physical community and a symbolic model of what Desteni believed humanity should become. Followers living there worked, ate, filmed content, attended meetings, and remained immersed in the movement's language almost constantly. Former members described an atmosphere where there was very little separation between personal life and ideological obligation. Everything became part of the process. Ordinary emotional reactions, frustration, attraction, jealousy, boredom, exhaustion, anxiety, or disagreement were treated as evidence of hidden programming that needed to be exposed and corrected. Followers were expected to examine themselves continuously through writing exercises, conversations, and public confession. Writing became one of the most central activities inside Desteni life. Members spent hours producing self-forgiveness statements, journals, blogs, and personal analyses documenting their thoughts and emotions in extreme detail. These writings were not private diaries in the normal sense. They often functioned as ideological exercises designed to prove that a member was confronting their mind systems honestly. The repetitive nature of the writing mattered psychologically. Followers constantly used Desteni terminology while analyzing themselves. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself. Over and over again, members broke down thoughts, emotional reactions, desires, fears, and memories through the same framework. Former insiders later described how the repetition slowly changed the way they thought internally, replacing ordinary emotional language with Desteni concepts about ego, programming, suppression, possession, and self-correction. The movement encouraged public exposure as proof of commitment. Vulnerability itself became part of participation. The more exposed someone became emotionally, the deeper they appeared committed to the process. This created an environment where privacy slowly eroded. Former members described feeling unable to separate personal identity from the movement because every thought and reaction became material for analysis or correction. Even ordinary uncertainty could quickly become evidence that someone was resisting the process. The buddy system reinforced this constantly. Inside Desteni, members were often paired with coaches, buddies, or more experienced participants responsible for monitoring progress and identifying signs of ego, dishonesty, or mind possession. These relationships created layers of accountability that kept members psychologically tied to the system throughout the day. Critics later compared this to surveillance through emotional dependency. If a member expressed doubt, frustration, or emotional exhaustion, the response was rarely sympathy in a normal sense. Instead, they were often told to investigate the hidden programming behind the reaction itself. Personal suffering became evidence that more process work was necessary. The emotional effect could become overwhelming. They learned to interpret emotions not as natural experiences, but as signs of hidden systems needing correction. Life on the farm also involved physical work and strict routines. Residents participated in labor connected to farming, content production, maintenance, animal care, and organizational tasks. Several former members described exhausting schedules, limited sleep, and pressure to remain productive almost constantly. The atmosphere could shift rapidly from philosophical discussion into humiliation or confrontation. Former insiders described criticism sessions where members were publicly challenged, emotionally broken down, or accused of acting from ego. Bernard Poolman himself developed a reputation for explosive verbal attacks during certain periods, with ex-members describing him as capable of turning suddenly aggressive, intimidating, or psychologically overwhelming during conversations. Some former followers claimed people experiencing emotional collapse were treated not as individuals needing care, but as people resisting the process or exposing hidden programming. One of the most striking patterns in former member testimony is how often emotional distress became reframed as proof that Desteni was working correctly. If someone felt broken down, confused, detached, guilty, or psychologically unstable, the explanation often returned to the same idea: their mind systems were collapsing, and more self-forgiveness was needed. This logic made the system very difficult to escape mentally. The internet side of Desteni intensified this environment even further. Unlike older, isolated cult communities, Desteni functioned as a continuous online ecosystem. Poolman lectures, portal interviews, blogs, and process discussions daily. Followers scattered across different countries could remain immersed in the ideology without physically living on the farm. eCafe eventually became one of the movement's major commercial platforms. It presented itself as a source for self-development, life mastery, and practical support through audio interviews, courses, and process material. Even today, the platform describes itself in language focused on self-awareness, writing, self-corrective application, and practical living, rather than emphasizing the more bizarre channeling origins that originally made Desteni infamous. The movement slowly shifted from shock value supernatural spectacle toward a more polished self-improvement presentation. But former members argued the underlying dynamics remained largely the same: emotional dependency, endless self-correction, financial extraction, and ideological control hidden beneath the language of empowerment. Money created another major pressure point. Desteni process, coaching systems, eCoff subscriptions, TechnoTutor involvement, and associated self-improvement products often required significant financial commitment from followers. Critics and ex-members repeatedly accused the movement of pushing vulnerable people toward expensive courses, coaching structures, and recruitment systems, while framing payment as investment in self-transformation. Some followers reportedly took on debt or neglected careers while remaining immersed in the movement's endless process work. Former insiders also described social isolation becoming increasingly normal inside Desteni circles. Non-members were often described as system people, trapped inside unconscious programming. Family members questioning the movement could become obstacles to growth. Romantic relationships, friendships, and personal goals were regularly filtered through Desteni ideology until followers struggled to separate their own desires from what the movement expected of them. For many former members, the emotional toll became visible only after leaving. Part 4. Ex-members, TechnoTutor, and cult allegations. As Desteni expanded online during the late 2000s and early 2010s, criticism of the movement expanded alongside it. What began initially as internet mockery over bizarre channeling videos slowly developed into something more serious as former members started speaking publicly about psychological pressure, emotional breakdowns, financial exploitation, and long-term harm they claimed followed involvement with the group. One of the reasons Desteni became difficult to dismiss entirely was the consistency running through many ex-member accounts. The details varied depending on the period someone joined and how deeply they became involved, but recurring themes appeared repeatedly: constant self-monitoring, emotional dependency, public humiliation, financial strain, ideological isolation, and the gradual erosion of personal identity through endless process work. Many former followers described entering the movement while vulnerable. Some were dealing with depression, trauma, anxiety, loneliness, spiritual confusion, family breakdowns, or frustration with mainstream society. Others arrived through intellectual curiosity after seeing the strange channeling videos online. Desteni's message initially appeared different from traditional cult recruitment because it framed itself as practical self-improvement rather than blind worship. That distinction mattered psychologically. People were not told they were joining a cult. They were told they were learning to dismantle mental programming and become more self-aware, honest, and responsible. Former members often described the early phase as empowering. The structure gave direction. The writing routines gave purpose. The community created belonging. The language of self-responsibility made people feel they were confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world. But over time, many said the process stopped feeling liberating and started feeling psychologically consuming. One of the largest sources of criticism came through online ex-member communities, particularly sites and channels connected to people who spent years inside the movement before leaving. The Leaving Desteni project, which identifies itself as being run by a former member involved for roughly a decade, became one of the most visible collections of testimony and criticism connected to the group. The accounts collected there painted a picture of increasing emotional control hidden underneath the language of equality and self-improvement. Former followers described a culture where nearly every problem became evidence of personal failure inside the process. If someone struggled emotionally, doubted leadership, became exhausted, questioned teachings, or wanted distance from the movement, the explanation usually returned to the same conclusion: their mind was resisting correction. This logic protected the system constantly. Any criticism could be reframed as ego. Any disagreement could become programming. Any emotional pain could become proof that deeper self-forgiveness was required. Several ex-members later said they reached a point where they no longer trusted their own instincts at all. Financial concerns became another major source of criticism. Desteni evolved beyond bizarre channeling videos into a network of commercial systems connected to coaching, educational software, self-development programs, and paid process work. The most controversial of these became TechnoTutor. TechnoTutor presented itself publicly as an educational technology platform designed to improve learning ability, reading speed, vocabulary, and cognitive performance. Former insiders, however, argued that it functioned partly as a recruitment and financial extraction system tied closely to Desteni ideology. Ex-members repeatedly accused the organization of using emotionally manipulative sales tactics, especially when targeting parents worried about children struggling academically or behaviorally. Some described the software as massively overpriced compared to what it actually offered. Others claimed distributors were encouraged to frame the product almost as a life-changing cognitive breakthrough, capable of transforming education, relationships, or even mental health. Former insiders also alleged strong MLM-style dynamics, where recruitment and sales pressure became tied to social standing and commitment inside the wider movement. The movement itself repeatedly rejected accusations that it operated as a pyramid scheme or cult. Remaining followers often described ex-members as reacting emotionally, trapped in ego, or unwilling to take self-responsibility. This created another familiar pattern seen in many high-control groups. Former members describing harm were often reframed internally as unreliable, bitter, unstable, or possessed by the mind. Online criticism toward Desteni became intense enough that entire communities formed around documenting former experiences and warning newcomers away from involvement. Websites, YouTube channels, Reddit discussions, and forum archives collected years of testimony from people describing emotional collapse, debt, manipulation, social isolation, and difficulty rebuilding their identity after leaving. One recurring theme involved the way Desteni language itself altered people's thinking. Former followers described losing the ability to process emotions normally because every reaction had been filtered for years through concepts like ego, programming, suppression, energetic possession, or self-correction. Some later compared the experience to having their own internal voice replaced gradually by the group's terminology. Several former members also described public humiliation and emotional breakdowns during their time connected to the farm or leadership circles. Accounts involving Bernard Poolman frequently portrayed him as intellectually intimidating, emotionally volatile, and capable of psychologically overpowering people during confrontations. Followers described feeling simultaneously terrified of disappointing him while also believing he possessed rare insight capable of exposing hidden truths about themselves. The contradiction created strong emotional dependency. Critics outside the movement began labeling Desteni openly as a cult by the early 2010s. Cult researchers and online observers pointed toward classic thought reform patterns: confession, loaded language, constant self-surveillance, dependency, group isolation, leader authority, financial extraction, and emotional control. Desteni rejected these accusations completely, arguing that it promoted practical self-honesty rather than manipulation. One reason the movement avoided major criminal prosecution is because much of the alleged harm existed in psychological and financial gray areas rather than clear violent criminal activity. Unlike some destructive cults connected directly to physical violence, armed standoffs, or large-scale fraud convictions, Desteni operated primarily through emotional influence, ideological immersion, coaching systems, internet recruitment, and self-help commercialization. There were no major criminal trials against Desteni leadership, no raids on the farm, no large fraud convictions, no prosecutions tied directly to the movement's belief system. That absence of legal action became something supporters pointed to repeatedly as proof the group was harmless. Critics argued the opposite. They claimed the lack of prosecution reflected how difficult psychological manipulation is to prosecute legally, especially inside systems presenting themselves as self-help education, online coaching, spirituality, or personal development. The internet itself also helped shield the movement. Desteni operated across forums, blogs, coaching systems, subscription services, YouTube channels, and online communities spread internationally. This decentralized structure allowed the movement to survive criticism, rebrand repeatedly, and continue functioning even after Bernard Poolman's death. Part 5, After Poolman, EKF, Rebranding, and What Remains. Bernard Poolman died from heart failure on August 11, 2013. Many outside observers assumed Desteni would disappear with him. The movement had always revolved around his authority, his cosmology, his psychological methods, and his ability to dominate followers intellectually and emotionally. Unlike larger religious organizations with formal succession systems or established institutions, Desteni was built around a relatively small inner circle, centered physically on the South African farm, and digitally through thousands of hours of online material tied directly to Poolman's worldview. Inside the movement, however, his death was not treated as the collapse outsiders expected. Followers framed it very differently. Public announcements surrounding his death emphasized continuity rather than crisis, insisting that Desteni had never been about guru worship and that the process itself could continue without him. Supporters portrayed Poolman as someone who had devoted his life entirely to exposing deception and helping humanity dismantle the mind-consciousness system. The movement quickly moved to stabilize itself publicly, partly because critics immediately began predicting the group's collapse. In practical terms, Desteni did survive, but in a very different form. Without Poolman's personality driving the movement constantly, the atmosphere became quieter, more commercial, and more focused on maintenance rather than expansion. The dramatic spectacle that originally drew attention online during the late 2000s slowly faded. The bizarre viral energy of Hitler channelings, demon interviews, reptilian cosmology, and endless dimensional revelations became less central publicly than they had been during the movement's peak visibility years. But the core ideas never disappeared. Sunet Spies remained active as the movement's portal, continuing to release material connected to interdimensional communication and process work through platforms tied to the group. The supernatural language became softer in some presentations, but the underlying worldview remained recognizable. Followers still treated Spies as someone capable of accessing hidden dimensions and entities through channeling work, even if the public presentation evolved into something more polished and less openly theatrical than the early YouTube era. One of the main centers of activity became Ecafe, an online platform connected to Desteni that presents itself as a source of self-development, practical living, emotional correction, and self-awareness material. The platform offers audio interviews, writing guidance, process discussions, relationship material, parenting advice, and self-forgiveness applications built directly from Desteni doctrine. To someone unfamiliar with the movement's history, parts of it can initially resemble ordinary self-help or mindfulness content. The language is often calmer and more marketable than the confrontational style associated with Bernard Poolman's earlier material. That shift was not accidental. After years of criticism and mockery online, gradually learned that its more extreme cosmological claims limited broader appeal. Personal growth, emotional awareness, practical application, and self-mastery, rather than leading publicly with reptilian creator gods or Hitler channelings. Critics argue this amounted to strategic rebranding rather than genuine ideological change. The same pattern appeared in the movement's commercial projects. As of the mid-2020s, the movement appears far smaller than it was during its peak internet visibility between roughly 2008 and 2013. The farm near Pietermaritzburg still exists. A small core group reportedly remains active there. Desteni-linked channels still circulate, although the audience appears niche compared to the movement's earlier viral period. What makes Desteni unusual compared to older cults is how deeply it belongs to the internet era. Many traditional high-control groups depended heavily on geographic isolation, physical compounds, or closed communal systems. Desteni certainly had elements of that on the farm itself, but much of its influence spread digitally. Followers could become deeply immersed without ever fully relocating physically. And even now, long after Bernard Poolman's death, the movement continues quietly in the background online, smaller than before, but still persistent, still recruiting occasionally, and still shaping the lives of the people who remain inside it. In the next episode of Hidden Cults, we travel to Ireland to examine Japa Meditation Ireland, a spiritual movement that presented itself through meditation, devotion, and Eastern philosophy, while former members and critics raised concerns about control, dependency, and the psychological influence operating beneath its peaceful image. That's next time.